The bruises on Temperance Ashford's wrists had faded to yellow by the time she walked into the marshal's office in Redding, California, but the fear in her green eyes remained as vivid as fresh paint. Marshal Crenshaw looked up from his desk, tobacco-stained fingers pausing over a stack of wanted posters, and she could see in his weathered face that he already knew what she was going to say before she opened her mouth to speak. "Miss Ashford," he said, his voice carrying the weariness of a man who had seen too much and believed too little. "What brings you here on this fine morning?" Temperance's hands trembled as she placed them flat on his desk, willing them to be still. The September heat of 1878 pressed against the windows of the small office, making the air thick and hard to breathe. She had practiced her words 100 times on the walk over from her boarding house, but now they stuck in her throat like dry bread. "It's about Samuel Garrett," she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "He attacked me. 3 nights ago in the alley behind the Golden Spur Saloon, he dragged me into the shadows and he put his hands on me and I fought him, but he was too strong, and I could not stop him from—" "Now hold on there," Marshal Crenshaw interrupted, raising one hand as if to physically stop her words. "That's a mighty serious accusation you're making. Samuel Garrett is a respected businessman in this town. He owns the lumber mill and half the buildings on Main Street. You got any proof of what you're claiming?" The question hit her like a slap. Proof. What proof could she offer except her own torn chemise, hidden now in the bottom of her trunk? What evidence existed beyond the violation of her own body? The bruises that were already fading, the scratches on her arms that could have come from anywhere. "I have my word," she said, hearing how weak it sounded even to her own ears. "I would not lie about something like this. He hurt me. He threatened me. He said if I told anyone, he would ruin whatever reputation I had left." Marshal Crenshaw leaned back in his chair, which creaked under his considerable weight. His eyes traveled over her in a way that made her skin crawl, assessing her as if she were livestock at auction. She knew what he saw. A 22-year-old woman, unmarried, working as a seamstress in a town where respectable women were either wives or heading quickly in that direction. Her blonde hair was pinned up properly, her dress modest and carefully mended, but none of that seemed to matter in the face of his skepticism. "Miss Ashford, I'm going to be straight with you. Even if what you're saying is true, and I'm not saying it is or it isn't, there's no way to prove it. It was dark, you said, in an alley, no witnesses, and you waited 3 days to come forward." He shook his head slowly. "That don't look good. Makes folks wonder why you didn't come running straight here if something so terrible happened." "I was ashamed," Temperance said, her voice breaking. "I was frightened. I did not know if anyone would believe me." "And you were right to wonder," the marshal said, not unkindly, but not sympathetically either. "Samuel Garrett's got himself a spotless reputation. He's on the town council. He donates to the church. You're asking me to take your word over his, and I just don't see how that's going to work out in your favor." Temperance felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had known this would be difficult, but she had not expected the door to slam shut so quickly in her face. "So he gets away with it. He gets away with what he did to me, and probably what he has done to other women, because it happened in the dark where no one could see." Marshal Crenshaw stood up, signaling that the conversation was over. "I'm sorry, Miss Ashford, I truly am. But unless you can bring me something more than your word against his, there's nothing I can do. My advice would be to forget about this whole ugly business and move on with your life. No good's going to come from stirring up trouble with a man like Samuel Garrett." She left the office feeling hollow, her footsteps echoing on the wooden boardwalk as she made her way back toward her small shop. The morning sun blazed overhead, promising another scorching afternoon. Redding in September was merciless, the heat rolling off the Sacramento River and settling over the town like a suffocating blanket. The smell of sawdust from Garrett's lumber mill mixed with the scent of horse manure and dust, creating the particular perfume of a frontier town trying to become something more civilized than it actually was. Her shop stood between a general store and a barber shop, a narrow building with a hand-painted sign that read Ashford Seamstress Services in neat letters. She had been so proud when she had first opened it 8 months ago. arriving in Reading with her inheritance from her deceased father and dreams of building an independent life. Independence was possible for women now in ways it had not been before, or so she had believed. She had thought that skill and hard work would be enough. She had not counted on Samuel Garrett. The bell above her door chimed as she entered, and she was surprised to find she was not alone. A man stood examining the fabric samples she kept displayed on a table near the window, his hat in his hands, his broad shoulders blocking the morning light. He turned when he heard her enter, and she found herself looking at a face that was both rugged and kind, weathered by sun and wind but softened by gray eyes that seemed to actually see her. "Madam," he said, nodding respectfully. "I hope you don't mind me waiting inside. The door was unlocked." "I forgot to lock it when I left," Temperance said, moving behind her counter where she felt safer, more in control. "What can I do for you, Mr. Preston Baker," he said, and his voice had the slow, measured quality of someone who thought before he spoke. "I'm looking to get some shirts made. I'm working on a ranch about 10 miles outside of town, and most of what I own is more holes than fabric at this point." Despite everything, Temperance felt a small smile tug at her lips. He was not wrong. His shirt was patched in several places and worn thin at the elbows, but it was clean, and he wore it with the unself-conscious dignity of a man who worked hard for his living and saw no shame in it. "I can certainly help with that," she said, pulling out her measuring tape and order book. "If you could step over here, I will take your measurements." Preston Baker moved to where she indicated, and as she worked, measuring his shoulders and arms and chest, she found herself relaxing slightly. There was something steady about him, something that felt safe. He stood still and patient, his eyes fixed on some point across the room rather than on her, giving her the privacy to work without feeling observed. "You're new to Reading," she said, more to fill the silence than because she needed to know. "Arrived about 2 weeks ago," he confirmed. "Hired on at the Crawford Ranch. Good people, fair wages. I've been drifting for a while, and this seemed like a decent place to settle for a spell." "Where are you from originally?" she asked, writing down his measurements. "Wyoming Territory," he said, "but I have not been back there in years. My folks died when I was young, and I have been making my own way since I was 16. I'm 26 now, in case you need that for your records." She did not need it for her records, but she appreciated knowing. It made him feel more real, less like a stranger, and more like a person. "I will have 3 shirts ready for you in 2 weeks," she said. "The cost will be $3. "That's fair," Preston said, reaching for his wallet. "I will pay you half now and half when I pick them up, if that suits you." "That suits me fine," she said, accepting the money and writing him a receipt. Their fingers brushed briefly during the exchange, and she was struck by how warm his hand was, how solid and real. After he left, she stood alone in her shop, surrounded by spools of thread and bolts of fabric, and realized that she had gone several minutes without thinking about Samuel Garrett or the marshal's dismissal. It was not much, but it was something. The next few days passed in a blur of work and worry. She kept her shop open and fulfilled her orders, but she could not shake the feeling that she was being watched. Sometimes she would look up from her sewing to see Samuel Garrett riding past on his fine black horse, and he would touch the brim of his hat to her in a mockery of politeness. The message was clear. He could do what he wanted, and there was nothing she could do about it. She began locking her door even during business hours, opening it only when customers knocked. She stopped going to the general store in the evening, limiting her errands to broad daylight when the streets were crowded. She moved through her life like a ghost, trying to make herself as small and unnoticeable as possible. It was on a Thursday afternoon, nearly 2 weeks after her visit to the marshal's office, that Preston Baker returned. She heard his knock and looked up to see him standing outside, his hat already in his hands. She unlocked the door and let him in, grateful for the interruption to her solitary thoughts. "Miss Ashford," he said, "I hope I am not too early. You said 2 weeks, and it has been just shy of that." "Your timing is perfect," she said, retrieving the package she had prepared containing his 3 new shirts. "I finished them yesterday." Would you like to try one on to make sure the fit is right? I trust your work, he said, but he took one from the package and slipped it on over his undershirt anyway. It fit him perfectly, the shoulders sitting exactly where they should, the sleeves the right length. He looked down at himself and then up at her with a genuine smile. This is the finest shirt I have owned in years. You do excellent work, Miss Ashford. The compliment warmed her in a way she had not expected. Thank you. I take pride in what I do. He paid her the remaining balance and then hesitated, turning his hat in his hands. Miss Ashford, I hope you don't think me forward for asking, but are you all right? You seem troubled. The concern in his voice was so unexpected, so genuine, that Temperance felt her carefully constructed composure begin to crack. She had not realized how desperately she needed someone to simply ask, to see past the facade she had been maintaining. I am managing, she said, but her voice betrayed her. Preston glanced toward the window, then back at her. I don't mean to pry into your business, but I have been in this town long enough now to hear things, and I have heard your name mentioned in ways I did not like. If you need help with something, or if someone is bothering you, I hope you know you can speak plainly. Temperance's heart began to pound. What have you heard? That Samuel Garrett has been saying things about you, spreading rumors that you have been making advances toward him, and that when he rejected you, you threatened to make up lies about him. Preston's expression was hard now, his gray eyes like flint. I have known men like Garrett before, men who use their position and their money to do whatever they please and then destroy anyone who tries to stand against them. She sank down onto the stool behind her counter, suddenly unable to stand. He attacked me, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Nearly 2 weeks ago, I went to the Marshal. But there was no proof. It happened in the dark, and there were no witnesses, and now Garrett is turning the whole thing around to make me look like a liar or worse. Preston set his package down on the counter and pulled up a chair, sitting down so that he was at eye level with her rather than looming over her. Tell me what happened. If you are comfortable doing so, I will believe you. Those 3 words, I will believe you, broke something open inside her. She told him everything, from the beginning, about how Garrett had been coming into her shop for weeks before the attack, always when she was alone, always making comments that felt just slightly inappropriate but not quite enough to complain about. How he had offered to invest in her business, to help her expand, if she would just be friendly with him. How she had refused politely at first and then more firmly. How she had been walking home from delivering an order when he had pulled her into the alley, his breath reeking of whiskey, his hands brutal and unyielding. Preston listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker with each detail. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working as if he were chewing on words too angry to release. The Marshal will not help you, he finally said, not because he does not believe you, but because he is afraid of Garrett. Or maybe he is on Garrett's payroll. Either way, the law is not going to give you justice. Then there is no justice, Temperance said bitterly. He wins. He gets away with what he did, and I have to live with it and hope he does not decide to come after me again. No, Preston said firmly. That is not how this ends. If the Marshal will not help, then we find another way. We bring what happened in the dark into the light, but we do it smart. We do it careful. We? Temperance looked at him with surprise. Why would you help me? You barely know me. Because it is the right thing to do, Preston said simply, and because I have a sister back in Wyoming territory, or I did last I heard. I have not seen her in years, but I think about her often. I think about what I would want someone to do if she were in your position. I would want someone to stand with her. Temperance felt tears welling up again, but this time she let them fall. I do not know how to fight a man like Samuel Garrett. Then it is a good thing you are not fighting him alone, Preston said. He reached out and placed his hand over hers where it rested on the counter, his touch warm and steady. We will figure this out together, but first I need you to write down everything you remember, every time he came into your shop, every word he said, every detail about the night he attacked you. dates, times, anything you can recall. Why? What good will that do? Because men like Garrett think they are untouchable, and that makes them careless. If he has done this to you, he has likely done it to others. We need to find those other women. We need to build a case that is so strong even the marshal cannot ignore it. Over the next several days, Preston became a fixture in Temperance's life. He would come by her shop in the evenings after finishing work at the Crawford Ranch, and they would talk strategy. He interviewed people around town carefully and discreetly, asking questions about Samuel Garrett. He learned that Garrett's first wife had died under suspicious circumstances 10 years ago, falling down the stairs in their home. He learned that several women who had worked in Garrett's lumber mill office had left town suddenly and without explanation. He learned that Garrett had a reputation among certain men in town as someone who liked to sample the merchandise, as they crudely put it, whether the merchandise was willing or not. But learning these things and proving them were two different matters entirely. Temperance found herself looking forward to Preston's visits with an intensity that surprised her. He treated her with a respect she had not experienced from many men, listening to her ideas and taking her seriously when she suggested courses of action. He was patient and thoughtful, never pushing her to move faster than she was comfortable with, never making her feel weak for having moments when the fear and anger threatened to overwhelm her. It was during one of these evening visits, about 3 weeks after they had first joined forces, that Temperance realized her feelings for Preston had shifted into something deeper than gratitude or friendship. They were sitting in her shop after closing, the last rays of October sunlight slanting through the windows, and he was telling her about his childhood in Wyoming Territory. "My father was a rancher," he said, his voice soft with memory. "Not a big operation, just enough cattle to keep us fed and clothed. My mother was from Boston originally. She came west as a school teacher and ended up marrying the first cowboy who made her laugh. She used to say she traded silk dresses for calico and never regretted it for a moment." "How did they die?" Temperance asked gently. "Influenza. Swept through our county when I was 16. Took them both within a week of each other. My sister Mary was only 12. I tried to keep the ranch going, but I was too young and too inexperienced. We lost everything. A neighbor family took Mary in, and I set out to make my fortune so I could send for her." His expression turned rueful. "That was 10 years ago. I have not made much of a fortune." "But you have made yourself into a good man," Temperance said. "That counts for more than money." Preston looked at her, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "You give me too much credit." "I do not think I give you enough," she said honestly. "You have risked your own reputation and safety to help me. You did not have to do any of this." "Yes, I did," he said quietly. "Maybe I needed to. Maybe I needed to prove to myself that I could protect someone when it mattered, since I could not protect my parents or keep my sister with me." She reached out and took his hand. Feeling the calluses on his palm from years of hard work, "You are protecting me now. You are doing more than anyone else in this town has been willing to do." They sat like that for a long moment, hands clasped, the silence between them comfortable and charged at the same time. Then Preston cleared his throat and gently withdrew his hand. "I should go. It is getting late, and you need to lock up." After he left, Temperance sat alone in the gathering darkness and acknowledged to herself what she had been trying to ignore. She was falling in love with Preston Baker. It was both the best and worst possible timing. The best because he made her feel alive again, made her remember that not all men were like Samuel Garrett. The worst because her life was currently a mess of accusations and counter-accusations, and she had no idea how any of it would resolve. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Preston was having a drink at the Golden Spur Saloon, carefully cultivating relationships with some of the ranch hands and mill workers who came through Redding, when he struck up a conversation with a woman named Daisy who worked there serving drinks. Daisy was in her 30s, sharp-eyed and sharp-tongued, and she had been working at the Golden Spur for 5 years. "I heard you have been asking questions about Samuel Garrett," she said, sliding into the chair across from Preston when he was sitting alone at a corner table. Preston did not deny it. "I have. Do you know something?" "I know plenty," Daisy said. The question is, what are you planning to do with the information? There's a woman he hurt, Preston said. She cannot prove what happened because it was done in the dark. I'm trying to help her bring it into the light. Daisy studied him for a long moment, as if assessing whether he was trustworthy. Finally, she leaned forward and lowered her voice. 3 years ago, there was a girl who worked here. Her name was Betty Simmons, sweet girl, only 19. Samuel Garrett took a liking to her, started coming around, buying her presents, making promises. She did not want his attention, but he would not take no for an answer. One night, he waited for her after her shift ended. She came to work the next day with bruises all over her arms and a look in her eyes like something had died inside her. Did she go to the marshal? Preston asked. She tried. Marshal Crenshaw told her the same thing he tells every woman who complains about Samuel Garrett. No proof, no case. Betty left town 2 weeks later. But before she left, she told me everything. She told me she was not the first, and she would not be the last. Where is Betty now? Preston asked. Last I heard, she was in Sacramento, working in a hotel. I have an address if you want it. I have been holding on to it, hoping someday someone would care enough to do something about Samuel Garrett. Preston took the address gratefully and immediately rode to Sacramento, a journey that took him 2 days. He found Betty working as a housekeeper in a respectable hotel, and at first she was reluctant to talk to him. But when he explained about Temperance, about what had happened and how she was trying to fight back, Betty's expression softened. I will help however I can, she said. I have been carrying what he did to me for 3 years. I am tired of carrying it alone. Betty agreed to write out a statement detailing everything Samuel Garrett had done to her, and she signed it in front of a notary. Preston also convinced her to come back to Reading, at least temporarily, to tell her story in person if needed. She was frightened, but she agreed. When Preston returned to Reading with Betty's statement, and Betty herself, Temperance cried tears of relief and gratitude. Finally, there was proof. Finally, there was someone else willing to stand up and say that Samuel Garrett was not the upstanding citizen he pretended to be. We need more, Preston said. One other woman is good, but if we can find others, we build a case that is impossible to ignore. Over the next 2 weeks, they worked tirelessly. Daisy helped them track down 2 other women who had left Reading after encounters with Samuel Garrett. One was living in San Francisco and agreed to send a notarized statement. The other was in a small town to the north and agreed to come to Reading to testify in person. Each story was slightly different in the details, but horrifyingly similar in the pattern. Garrett targeting women who had little power or protection, using his position and wealth to corner them, attacking them when they refused his advances, and then threatening or bribing them into silence. By the time they had gathered 4 women's testimonies, including Temperance's, even Marshal Crenshaw could not ignore the evidence. Preston and Temperance brought everything to his office on a cold November morning, laying it all out on his desk in a neat, organized file. This is a pattern, Preston said, his voice hard. This is not one woman lying or one misunderstanding. This is 4 different women spanning multiple years, all telling the same story about the same man. You cannot dismiss this. Marshal Crenshaw read through the statements with a deepening frown. When he finished, he looked up at Preston and Temperance with an expression that was equal parts irritation and resignation. This is going to cause a lot of trouble. Good, Temperance said firmly. Samuel Garrett deserves trouble. He deserves justice. Justice and what is practical are not always the same thing, the marshal said, but he sighed and stood up, reaching for his coat. I will bring him in for questioning, but I am warning you, Miss Ashford, this is going to get ugly. Garrett has friends in this town, powerful friends. They are not going to take kindly to one of their own being accused of this. Let them be unkind, Temperance said. I am not backing down. The arrest of Samuel Garrett sent shockwaves through Reading. The man was taken into custody on a Tuesday afternoon right in the middle of Main Street where everyone could see. He protested loudly, claiming it was all lies and slander, threatening to sue the marshal and everyone involved. But Marshal Crenshaw, to his credit, did not back down once he had committed to the arrest. The trial was set for 3 weeks later, which gave both sides time to prepare. Garrett hired the most expensive lawyer he could find, a slick-talking man from San Francisco who specialized in defending wealthy clients. Temperance and the other women had to rely on the local prosecutor, a young man named Thomas Hendricks who was honest but inexperienced. Preston stood by Temperance through all of it, attending every meeting with the prosecutor, sitting with her when she went over her testimony again and again. He became her anchor, the steady presence that kept her from being swept away by the fear and stress. It was during one of these late-night preparation sessions that everything between them came to a head. They were in her shop long after dark, and Temperance was pacing back and forth, too anxious to sit still. "What if they do not believe us?" she said. "What if we have gone through all of this, brought all these women forward, and the jury decides we are all lying?" "Then we will have tried," Preston said. "We will have done everything we could." "That is not enough," Temperance said, her voice breaking. "I need him to pay for what he did. I need the world to know that what he did was wrong." Preston stood up and caught her by the shoulders, gently but firmly. "Listen to me. No matter what happens in that courtroom, you have already won. You have stood up for yourself. You have given those other women the courage to stand up too. You have refused to be silenced or shamed. That matters, Temperance. That matters more than any verdict." She looked up at him, at his strong, kind face, at the gray eyes that had never looked at her with anything but respect and admiration. "I could not have done any of this without you." "Yes, you could have," he said softly. "You are stronger than you know. I have just been walking beside you while you proved it." "I do not want you just walking beside me," Temperance said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I want you with me. I want you in my life, Preston, not just for this trial, but after. I want—" She stopped, suddenly afraid she had said too much, revealed too much. But Preston was smiling, a real, genuine smile that transformed his entire face. "I want that too. I have wanted that since the day I first walked into your shop, but I did not want to complicate things while all of this was happening. I did not want you to feel like you owed me anything." "I do not feel like I owe you," Temperance said. "I feel like I am falling in love with you. There is a difference." Preston pulled her into his arms, holding her close, and she felt safer than she had in months. "I am already in love with you," he said into her hair. "I have been for weeks. I just did not know if it was right to say so." She pulled back enough to look up at him. "It is right. This is the one thing in my life right now that feels completely right." He kissed her then, soft and careful, as if she were something precious that might break. She kissed him back, pouring into it all the emotion she had been holding back, the fear and the anger and the hope and the love. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing hard. "After the trial," Preston said, "after all of this is over, I'm going to court you properly. I'm going to take you to dinner and buy you flowers and ask your permission to hold your hand." Temperance laughed, the sound watery but genuine. "You already have my permission to hold my hand." "Then I am going to hold it every day," he said, lacing his fingers through hers. The trial began on a gray December morning, the kind of day where the sky pressed down low and heavy over the town. The courthouse was packed with people, curiosity seekers and gossips, and those few genuine souls who wanted to see justice done. Samuel Garrett sat at the defendant's table looking confident and dignified, every inch the respectable businessman wrongly accused. Temperance was the first to testify. She walked to the witness stand with her head held high, her hand briefly touching Preston's shoulder as she passed him in the gallery. She swore to tell the truth, and then she told her story. She did not spare any details, did not try to make it less ugly than it was. She looked directly at the jury as she spoke, 12 men who held her fate in their hands. Garrett's lawyer tried to tear her testimony apart during cross-examination, suggesting she had been drinking that night, implying she had encouraged Garrett's attention, insinuating she was making the whole thing up because he had refused to invest in her business. Temperance held firm, answering each question calmly and clearly, refusing to be shaken. Betty Simmons testified next, and then the other two women who had come forward. Each of them told their story, and each of them withstood the defense lawyer's attempts to discredit them. By the time the prosecution rested its case, there was a clear pattern established. Samuel Garrett was a predator who used his power and position to victimize vulnerable women. The defense tried to call character witnesses for Garrett, men who testified to his upstanding nature and his contributions to the community. But the weight of 4 women's testimonies, all telling remarkably consistent stories, was hard to counter with vague assertions about his business acumen and church attendance. The trial lasted 4 days. On the afternoon of the 4th day, the jury retired to deliberate. Temperance sat in the courtroom with Preston beside her, holding her hand tightly. Betty and the other women were there too, along with Daisy from the saloon and a handful of other townspeople who had quietly begun to support them as the trial progressed. The jury was out for 3 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood and announced the verdict. Guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted. Samuel Garrett shouted that it was a travesty of justice, that he was being railroaded, that he would appeal. But the judge banged his gavel and sentenced Garrett to 15 years in prison, and just like that it was over. Temperance sat frozen in her seat, unable to quite process what had just happened. They had won. After everything, after all the fear and doubt and struggle, they had actually won. Preston pulled her into his arms, and she buried her face in his chest and cried, great heaving sobs of relief and release. Around them, the other women were crying too and hugging each other, and for the first time in a long time, Temperance felt like she could breathe fully. That evening, after the courthouse had cleared and Samuel Garrett had been taken away to begin serving his sentence, Preston walked Temperance back to her shop. The streets of Reading were quiet, the December chill settling over the town like a blanket. She leaned against him as they walked, exhausted but triumphant. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now you get to live your life," Preston said. "You get to run your business and wake up without fear and build whatever future you want." "And what about you?" she asked. "What do you want?" Preston stopped walking and turned to face her, taking both of her hands in his. "I want to be part of that future, if you will have me. I want to court you properly, like I said. I want to marry you if you will say yes when the time comes. I want to help you run your shop or buy a little ranch or whatever it is you want to do. I want to build a life with you, Temperance." She smiled up at him. This good, steady man who had stood by her when no one else would. "I want all of that too. Yes to all of it whenever you are ready to ask." "I am ready now," Preston said, "but I will wait until I can do it right. Until I can buy you a proper ring and ask you somewhere romantic instead of in the middle of Main Street." "I do not need romantic," Temperance said. "I just need you." But Preston was a man of his word, and he did court her properly over the next few months. He took her to dinner at the hotel restaurant, the nicest place in Reading. He bought her flowers from the general store, whatever blooms were available in the winter months. He came by her shop every evening after work, and they would sit together and talk about their days, about their dreams for the future, about everything and nothing. Temperance found herself healing in ways she had not expected. The trial had given her a sense of closure, but Preston's steady love gave her something more. The ability to trust again, to believe that not all men were monsters, to imagine a future that was not defined by what had been done to her. In March of 1879, Preston took Temperance on a picnic up in the hills above Reading, where the wildflowers were just beginning to bloom, and the air was warm with the promise of spring. He spread a blanket under an oak tree and unpacked the basket of food they had brought. And after they had eaten, he pulled a small velvet box from his pocket. "I've been carrying this around for 2 weeks, waiting for the right moment," he said, his hands steady but his voice nervous. "I finally realized that there is no such thing as a perfect moment. There is just this moment, right now, with you." He opened the box to reveal a simple gold band with a small diamond. Nothing ostentatious, but clearly chosen with care. "Temperance Ashford, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" "Yes," she said, not even having to think about it. "Yes, absolutely yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, as if it had been made just for her. Then he kissed her, and she kissed him back, and the world narrowed down to just the two of them under the oak tree with the wildflowers blooming all around. They were married in May, a small ceremony in the church with just a handful of friends attending. Betty came back to Reading for the wedding, as did one of the other women who had testified against Samuel Garrett. Daisy was there, and so were Mr. and Mrs. Crawford from the ranch where Preston worked. Marshal Crenshaw even showed up looking uncomfortable but sincere when he congratulated them. Temperance wore a dress she had made herself, cream-colored silk with lace trim, the finest thing she had ever created. Preston wore a new suit, purchased specially for the occasion, and he looked so handsome standing at the altar waiting for her that she felt her breath catch. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Preston kissed her with such tenderness that several people in the small congregation wiped away tears. Temperance knew in that moment that everything she had been through, all the pain and fear and struggle, had been worth it to arrive at this place, this moment, this man. They moved into a small house on the edge of town, close enough to Temperance's shop that she could walk to work, but far enough out to have a little land and some privacy. Preston continued working at the Crawford Ranch while Temperance ran her seamstress business, and they settled into the rhythms of married life with surprising ease. In the evenings, they would sit on their porch and watch the sun set over the Sacramento River, talking about their day, or simply enjoying the comfortable silence that came from being with someone who understood you completely. Preston proved to be everything Temperance could have hoped for in a husband: kind, patient, hardworking, and devoted. He never once made her feel like she owed him for what he had done during the trial. He never threw it in her face or used it as leverage. It was simply something he had done because it was right, and now they were moving forward together. A year after their wedding, Temperance discovered she was pregnant. The news filled her with joy and terror in equal measure. She had not been sure she would ever want children after what Samuel Garrett had done to her, but with Preston, everything felt safe and possible. Their son was born in February of 1880, a healthy baby with his father's gray eyes and a shock of dark hair. They named him Henry Preston Baker, and from the moment Preston held his son for the first time, Temperance knew she had married the right man. He was so gentle with the baby, so patient and attentive, and he threw himself into fatherhood with the same steady dedication he brought to everything else. Temperance had to temporarily close her shop to care for Henry, but she found she did not mind as much as she thought she would. There would be time later to return to her business. For now, she was content to be a wife and mother, to build this family with Preston, to create a home filled with love and safety. But she did not forget what she had been through, and she did not forget the women who had stood with her. She kept in touch with Betty and the others, writing letters and occasionally visiting when circumstances allowed. She also began quietly helping other women in Reading who found themselves in situations where they needed support or advocacy. Her own experience had taught her the importance of believing women when they spoke up, of standing with them even when it was difficult or uncomfortable. When Henry was 2 years old, Temperance reopened her shop on a limited basis, working just a few hours a day while Preston watched their son. The business had not suffered as much as she feared during her absence. Her reputation for quality work had kept customers loyal, and she quickly rebuilt her client base. In 1882, their daughter was born, a beautiful girl with blonde hair and her mother's green eyes. They named her Carolyn Margaret Baker, and Preston joked that he was now hopelessly outnumbered in a house full of strong-willed individuals. Temperance had never seen him happier than when he was playing with their children, making them laugh with silly voices and gentle tickling. Life was not perfect. There were hard times, months when money was tight or when sickness passed through the household. There were moments when Temperance would still wake up from nightmares about Samuel Garrett, even though he was safely locked away in prison. But Preston was always there, holding her, until the fear passed, reminding her that she was safe, that she was loved, that the past did not get to define her future. By 1885, 7 years after they had first met, Temperance and Preston had built a life that was rich in all the ways that mattered. Their children were healthy and happy. Her business was thriving. Preston had been promoted to foreman at the Crawford Ranch, a position that came with better pay and more respect. They had added onto their house, giving them more space and comfort. One evening in the summer of that year, after the children were asleep and they were sitting on their porch watching the stars come out, Preston took Temperance's hand and said, "Do you remember what I said to you the night of the trial verdict? That you could build whatever future you wanted?" "I remember," Temperance said. "Have you built the future you wanted?" he asked. She looked around at their home, thought about her children sleeping inside, felt the warmth of his hand in hers. "I have built something better than I ever imagined wanting," she said. "I did not know this kind of happiness was possible." "Neither did I," Preston said, "but I am grateful for it every single day." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, and then Temperance said, "There is something I never properly thanked you for." "You have thanked me 100 times," Preston said. "No, not for the trial or the investigation. I mean for believing me. That very first day when I told you what Samuel Garrett had done, you said you believed me. You have no idea what those words meant. Everyone else wanted proof, wanted evidence, wanted me to justify my own victimization, but you just believed me. That was the moment everything started to change." Preston was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "Of course I believed you. You are one of the most honest people I have ever met. And even if I had not known that about you, I still would have believed you. Because when a woman says she has been hurt, the right response is to believe her and help her, not to interrogate her and make her prove it." Temperance leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. "You helped bring what happened in the dark into the light. You gave me my life back." "We gave each other our lives," Preston said. "I was just drifting before I met you. You gave me purpose and direction and a reason to stay in one place. You gave me a family and a home. You gave me love. We saved each other, Temperance." She lifted her head to look at him, this man who had become her entire world. "I love you, Preston Baker." "I love you too, Temperance Baker," he said. And he kissed her as the stars wheeled overhead and their children slept safe inside their home. The years continued to pass, each one bringing its own joys and challenges. In 1887, Temperance gave birth to their third child, another son they named Thomas William Baker. Preston joked that now the numbers were even, 2 boys, 1 girl, and 2 parents to referee. Henry was 7 by then, Caroline was 5, and both of them were fascinated by their new baby brother. Temperance had worried that managing 3 children and her business would be too much, but she found that she was stronger than she had given herself credit for. Preston was an active, involved father who split childcare duties with her equally, which was unusual for the time but perfectly normal for them. They had built their marriage on partnership and equality, and they extended that philosophy to every aspect of their lives. In 1889, tragedy touched their lives when Mrs. Crawford, the wife of Preston's employer, died suddenly from a heart ailment. Mr. Crawford was devastated, and in his grief he made Preston an unexpected offer. He wanted to sell the ranch and move back east to be near his grown children, and he wanted to sell it to Preston at a price he could afford with generous payment terms. Preston and Temperance talked long into the night about whether to accept the offer. It would mean taking on significant debt and responsibility. It would mean Preston leaving the security of a steady wage for the uncertainty of running his own operation. But it would also mean building something lasting for their children, something they could be proud of. They decided to take the risk. With a combination of their savings, a loan from the bank, and Mr. Crawford's generosity, they purchased the ranch in the spring of 1890. It was 300 acres of good grazing land with a small herd of cattle, a barn, several outbuildings, and a larger house than the one they currently lived in. The transition was not easy. There were times when Temperance wondered if they had made a mistake, if they had bitten off more than they could chew. But Preston worked harder than she had ever seen anyone work, up before dawn, and often not stopping until after dark. And Temperance worked just as hard, managing the household and the children while still taking in sewing work to bring in extra money. Slowly, gradually, the ranch began to prosper. Preston proved to be a skilled cattleman with a good eye for livestock and a talent for management. He hired a few ranch hands to help with the work, treating them fairly and earning their loyalty. The cattle multiplied, the land improved under careful stewardship, and the ranch's reputation grew. By 1893, the ranch was profitable enough that Temperance could finally stop worrying about money. She closed her seamstress shop, though she still sewed for family and friends, and devoted herself full-time to managing the household and supporting Preston in running the ranch. She kept the books, managed supplies and inventory, and handled correspondence with buyers and suppliers. Their children grew up healthy and happy, running wild on the ranch land, learning to ride horses and herd cattle. Henry showed an aptitude for working with animals that delighted his father. Caroline was bookish and loved to read, often found curled up in a corner with whatever book she could get her hands on. Thomas was adventurous and fearless, always climbing trees and exploring places he probably should not have been. In 1895, Temperance surprised everyone, including herself, by becoming pregnant again at the age of 39. Their fourth child, a daughter they named Lucy Ann Baker, was born healthy and perfect in early 1896. Preston was 51 by then, his hair graying at the temples and lines appearing around his eyes, but he approached fatherhood for the fourth time with the same joy and dedication he had brought to it the first 3 times. The older children adored their baby sister, and Lucy became the darling of the family. By this time, Henry was 16 and helping run the ranch alongside his father. Caroline was 14 and had announced her intention to become a teacher, already helping instruct the younger children in reading and arithmetic. Thomas was 12 and still getting into various scrapes and adventures. One evening, in the summer of 1897, nearly 20 years after they had first met, Preston and Temperance took a rare moment alone to ride up into the hills above the ranch. They had done this occasionally over the years, stealing time away from the demands of family and business to simply be together. They sat on the same hillside where Preston had proposed all those years ago, though the oak tree had grown considerably in the intervening decades. The view stretched out before them, their ranch land, the town of Reading in the distance, the river winding through the valley like a silver ribbon. "Do you ever think about how different our lives could have been?" Temperance asked. "If you had not walked into my shop that day, if you had not believed me, if we had not fought back against Samuel Garrett?" "I try not to," Preston admitted, "because thinking about losing you, even in a hypothetical sense, is more than I can bear." "I read in the newspaper that he died last year," Temperance said quietly, "in prison. I thought I would feel something when I heard relief or satisfaction or closure, but I felt nothing. He has been irrelevant to my life for so long that even his death did not touch me." "That is the best revenge," Preston said. "Not just defeating him, but moving on to build a life so full and rich that he becomes a footnote in your story rather than the defining chapter." "Our story," Temperance corrected. "This has always been our story, Preston. You and me together." "You and me together," he agreed, pulling her close. "I would not have it any other way." They sat there as the sun set, turning the sky brilliant shades of orange and pink and purple, and Temperance thought about everything they had built together. It had started with her needing help to bring something done in the dark into the light, but it had become so much more than that. It had become a true partnership, a deep and abiding love, a family, a legacy. In 1900, Henry married a local girl named Sarah Jenkins, and they held the wedding on the ranch. Watching her son pledge his love to his bride, Temperance felt the circle of life completing itself. She and Preston were no longer the young couple struggling to build a life. They were the established generation, watching their children step into adulthood. Henry and Sarah settled in a small house on the ranch property, and Henry took on more and more of the daily management of the cattle operation. Preston was happy to step back slightly, though he never fully retired. He still worked the ranch every day, just at a less punishing pace. In 1902, Carolyn left home to attend normal school in Sacramento, determined to fulfill her dream of becoming a teacher. It was hard for Temperance to watch her daughter go, but she was proud of Carolyn's ambition and determination. Preston wrote to Carolyn every week, long letters full of news from home and fatherly advice. Thomas turned 21 in 1903 and announced that he was not interested in ranching. He wanted to see the world, to have adventures beyond the borders of California. Temperance's heart broke a little at the thought of her adventurous son leaving, but Preston supported the decision. "Let him go," Preston told her. "He needs to find his own path. He will come back when he's ready, and if he does not, we will know he found something that made him happy elsewhere." Thomas left in the spring of 1903, heading first to San Francisco and then planning to work his way north toward Oregon and Washington Territory. He wrote home regularly, and his letters were full of excitement about the things he was seeing and doing. That left just Lucy at home, a bright and cheerful 7-year-old who had her father wrapped completely around her little finger. Preston, now 63 years old, spent his afternoons teaching Lucy to ride and telling her stories about her older siblings when they were young. One day in the autumn of 1904, a young woman came to the ranch looking for Temperance. She was in her early 20s, and she introduced herself as Margaret Walsh from Sacramento. She had heard about Temperance from someone who knew someone, and she needed help. Temperance invited her inside and listened as Margaret told a story that was painfully familiar. A man in a position of power who had forced himself on her, a marshal who would not believe her, a community that blamed her for speaking up. Margaret had heard that Temperance had faced something similar years ago and had somehow managed to win, and she was hoping for advice or help or just someone who would believe her. Temperance looked at this young woman so full of fear and determination and saw herself 26 years earlier. She took Margaret's hands in hers and said, "I believe you, and I will help you." Over the next several months, Temperance became Margaret's advocate and supporter. She connected her with a lawyer in Sacramento who had experience with such cases. She helped Margaret gather evidence and find other women who had been victimized by the same man. She provided emotional support and practical assistance, drawing on everything she had learned from her own experience. Preston supported Temperance's decision to help Margaret, even though it meant she was often traveling to Sacramento for meetings or spending long hours writing letters and organizing documents. He understood that this was important to her, that helping other women was part of how she made meaning from what she had survived. Margaret's case went to trial in early 1905, and the man who had attacked her was convicted and sentenced to prison. Margaret came to the ranch afterward to thank Temperance in person, tears streaming down her face. "You saved me," Margaret said, "just like someone saved you." "No," Temperance said gently. "You saved yourself by having the courage to speak up and fight back. I just walked beside you while you did it, the same way someone once walked beside me." After Margaret left, Preston found Temperance standing in the yard, looking out over the ranch with a thoughtful expression. "What are you thinking?" he asked, slipping his arm around her waist. "I'm thinking that maybe this is what it was all for," Temperance said. "Everything I went through with Samuel Garrett, all the pain and fear and struggle, maybe it was so I could help women like Margaret. Maybe it was so I could be the person for them that you were for me." "You have always been more than a survivor," Preston said. "You have been an inspiration." "We have been an inspiration," she corrected. "This is still our story, remember?" He kissed her temple. "Our story, always and forever." As 1905 turned into 1906, life on the ranch continued its steady rhythm. Henry and Sarah had their first child, a son they named Preston Henry Baker after his grandfather. Preston cried when they told him the name, overcome with emotion at the thought of his legacy continuing into another generation. Caroline came home from Sacramento with a teaching position secured at the Reading Schoolhouse, planning to start in the fall. She had also brought home a beau, a young lawyer named David Morrison, and by Christmas, they were engaged. Thomas wrote from Seattle, where he had found work on the docks and was apparently thriving in his independent life. His letter suggested he had met someone, though he was characteristically vague about the details. Temperance missed him terribly, but tried to be happy that he had found his place in the world. Lucy, now 10 years old, was growing into a confident, intelligent young woman. She loved the ranch and had announced her intention to help run it when she grew up, which pleased Henry to no end and made Preston laugh with pride. In the spring of 1906, Preston and Temperance celebrated their 27th wedding anniversary. Their children threw them a party on the ranch, inviting neighbors and friends from town. The yard was filled with people eating and drinking and dancing, and at the center of it all were Preston and Temperance, gray-haired now but still clearly deeply in love. At one point during the party, Preston pulled Temperance away from the crowd and led her to their favorite spot under the old oak tree. They could still hear the music and laughter from the party, but here they had a moment of relative privacy. 27 years, Preston said, shaking his head in wonder. Sometimes it feels like just yesterday that I walked into your shop looking to buy some shirts. Other times it feels like I've known you my entire life. Both things can be true, Temperance said, leaning against him. We have lived several lifetimes' worth of experiences together. Do you have any regrets? Preston asked. Temperance considered the question seriously. I regret that I had to go through what I went through with Samuel Garrett. I wish that had never happened. But I do not regret anything that came after. I do not regret fighting back. I do not regret meeting you. I do not regret any of the choices we made together. So no, I do not have regrets about our life. Neither do I, Preston said. Not a single one. They stood there together, holding each other under the oak tree where he had proposed so many years ago, and watched their family and friends celebrate down below. This was their legacy, not just the ranch or the businesses or the material things they had built, but the love and support and justice they had created in their corner of the world. Years continued to pass. In 1908, Carolyn married David Morrison, and the wedding was even bigger than Henry's had been. In 1909, Thomas finally came home for a visit, bringing with him a wife he had married in Seattle, a woman named Claire who was smart and funny and fit perfectly into the family. Preston turned 70 in 1910, an age he had never particularly expected to reach. He was still active and sharp-minded, though he had finally fully handed over the ranch management to Henry. He spent his days doing light work around the property, playing with his grandchildren, and sitting with Temperance on their porch. Temperance was 54 that same year, her blonde hair now streaked with silver, her face lined with wrinkles earned from years of laughter and worry, and life fully lived. She had become a respected figure in Redding, known not just as Preston Baker's wife or the woman who had brought down Samuel Garrett, but as someone who helped other women, who spoke up for justice, who made her community better. In 1912, Lucy turned 16 and began courting a young ranch hand named Joseph Carter, who worked on their property. Preston was initially resistant to the idea of his baby girl growing up, but Temperance reminded him that Lucy had a good head on her shoulders and they needed to trust her judgment. By 1914, Preston and Temperance had 6 grandchildren, with more on the way. Their home was always full of noise and chaos and love, exactly the way they wanted it. They had built something that would outlast them, something good and strong and true. One evening in the late summer of 1915, when Preston was 75 and Temperance was 59, they took another ride up to their spot under the oak tree. It was becoming harder for Preston to make the climb, his joints stiff with age, but he insisted on going. I want to see it one more time, he said. Though he did not specify what he meant by one more time. They sat together watching the sunset, as they had done so many times before, and Temperance felt a sense of peace settle over her. She had lived a good life. She had survived trauma and come out the other side stronger. She had loved and been loved in return. She had raised good children and helped build a thriving family business. She had made a difference in the lives of women who came after her. Preston, she said softly, thank you. For what? He asked. For everything. For believing me when no one else would. For standing by me through the trial. For marrying me and building this life with me. For being exactly the man I needed at exactly the moment I needed him. Preston took her hand, his grip still strong despite his age. Temperance, loving you has been the greatest honor and privilege of my life. You are the strongest, bravest, most remarkable woman I have ever known. Thank you for letting me be part of your story." "Our story," she corrected, as she always did. "Our story," he agreed with a smile. They sat there until the stars came out, holding hands and watching their ranch spread out below them. Somewhere down there, their children and grandchildren were going about their evening routines, living the lives that Preston and Temperance had made possible. The dark thing that had happened to Temperance all those years ago had been brought into the light, and from that light had grown something beautiful and lasting. Preston lived for another 3 years, passing away peacefully in his sleep in the spring of 1918 at the age of 78. Temperance held his hand as he took his last breath, whispering that she loved him and would see him again someday. The funeral was attended by what seemed like half of Shasta County, a testament to the respect and affection that Preston had earned over his lifetime. Temperance lived for 12 more years after Preston's death, remaining active and engaged in the ranch and in her community. She helped raise several more grandchildren and even a few great-grandchildren. She continued her quiet work helping women who needed support or advocacy, never seeking recognition but always ready to help when called upon. She passed away in her sleep in the winter of 1930 at the age of 74. Her children buried her next to Preston under the oak tree where he had proposed, where they had spent so many evenings watching the sunset together. The headstone read simply, "Temperance Ashford Baker, 1856-1930. Beloved wife, mother, grandmother. She brought light into the darkness." At her funeral, Henry stood up and told the story of how his parents had met, how his father had helped his mother bring justice against a man who had hurt her, how that act of courage and compassion had grown into a love that had lasted nearly 40 years and created a family that now numbered in the dozens. "My mother used to say that the worst thing that ever happened to her led to the best thing that ever happened to her," Henry said, his voice thick with emotion, "because if she had not needed help, she might never have found my father. And if my father had not chosen to help her, he might never have found her. They saved each other, and in saving each other, they built something that will last for generations." And it did last. The ranch that Preston and Temperance had built together remained in the family for decades, passed down from Henry to his children and then to their children. The story of how Preston had helped Temperance bring what was done in the dark into the light became a family legend, told and retold at gatherings and celebrations. But more than the story, what lasted was the example they had set. That love means believing someone when they tell you they have been hurt, that justice is worth fighting for even when the odds seem impossible, that two people working together can overcome things that would destroy them individually, and that from the darkest moments can grow the brightest lights. Their love story became a beacon for others, proof that even when terrible things happen, even when the world seems stacked against you, it is possible to find someone who will stand beside you and help you fight for what is right. Preston and Temperance's story reminded people that courage and compassion and love can change the world, one person at a time, one act of kindness at a time, one decision to believe and help and stand together at a time. And so, though they were gone, their legacy lived on in the ranch they had built, in the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren they had raised, in the women whose lives had been changed by Temperance's advocacy, and in the example they had set of what true love and partnership could look like. The cowboy had helped bring what was done in the dark into the light, and from that light had grown a love that illuminated not just their own lives, but the lives of everyone they touched. It was a story worth telling, worth remembering, worth passing down through the generations as a reminder that even in the hardest times there are good people who will stand with you, believe in you, and help you fight for justice. And sometimes, if you are very lucky, those good people become the great love of your life, and together you build something that lasts forever.